Well, good morning, everybody. I love all the talk. I love all the hanging out. It's great. It was even happening on stage still, which is super fun. So I'm glad you guys are here. My name is Joel. I'm one of the pastors here at Church Cane Bay, and I'm just really excited to dig into God's Word with you this morning. If you've got your Bibles, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 41. Genesis chapter 41, or if you have your Bible app on your phone, you can click on hit the little three lines, and then click on events and find Church of Cane Bay, and our notes will be there. Or you can just go to Genesis 41. We're going to spend all of our time really in that section today. And we're continuing a series called Joseph. We've been looking, last week Pastor Will kind of kicked off the story of Joseph. And if you were here, or maybe you remember, you know that Joseph's story didn't start out so well. Things were difficult for him in the beginning because of some jealousy from his brothers. They ended up throwing him in a deep pit and kind of leaving him there. And then they made a decision, instead of killing him, we'll just sell him into slavery. And so they did that. And then he ended up as a slave in the house of a guy named Potiphar. And eventually, Potiphar's wife accused him of rape, even though he didn't have anything to do with it, and ran away from the situation. And that landed him in prison. And so in Genesis chapter 40, the chapter before what we're going to be looking at today, Joseph begins to use some gifts that God has given him. And one of the gifts that God gave Joseph was the ability to interpret dreams, which is kind of a strange one for us, right? I don't know if some of you guys have the gift of interpreting dreams, let me know, but this is a thing that Joseph had. And there were two specific guys in prison with him. One was a baker and one was a cupbearer. And they had worked for Pharaoh. And Pharaoh is the most powerful man in the world at this point in time. He's over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh had thrown these guys who worked for him in prison, his baker and his cupbearer. And so while they're in prison, they have weird dreams. And they share those dreams. And one day Joseph hears about them, and Joseph interprets their dreams. And sadly for the baker, it meant that he was going to be killed, which he was. But for the cupbearer, it means that he was going to be restored. He was going to get his job back and was going to be working for Pharaoh again. And so that's what we see happen to this guy. Now the cupbearer made a promise to Joseph that he was going to tell Pharaoh exactly who Joseph was, and that he was wrongfully accused and thrown in prison for something he didn't do. But the cupbearer, moving back to his high standing position, completely forgot about Joseph and didn't do it. But despite all of that, today in Joseph's story, we're gonna see his life take a big swing up. A big shift is gonna happen where Joseph is gonna go from experiencing what most of us would consider really bad circumstances, worse than any of us will probably ever go through in our lives, to all of a sudden achieving more than we could possibly ever imagine achieving in life. He's going to move from prison to prosperity very quickly. And in doing so, the thing that we have to learn from Joseph is that Joseph never forgot that God was with him. And I pray that through his story today, we get to look at our own lives, our own story. Because truthfully, we've been given lots of great opportunities. We've been given lots of great gifts. We've been given lots of great blessings. And God gave us those things for a purpose and for a reason. And a lot of us maybe here this morning, we may be looking at our lives and saying, I don't feel like my life is that great. I don't feel like it's that prosperous. I don't feel like it's that blessed. Right now, things are pretty bad. And it's really easy for us to look at our lives that way, but if you really stop and you take a step back and you look at your life and you see what God has done for you, it's actually not that hard to realize that God has blessed us. God has been faithful. God has been good to us. Just the fact that we're in this room this morning, in this community, in this country, is something that God did purposely for us. Did you know that the poorest 20% of people here in America consume more goods and services than the vast majority of people in all the affluent countries around the world? The poorest 20%. We have more then we are able to look at our lives and give God credit for. He's blessed us more than we can imagine. The bottom 5% of people in America are richer than almost 70% of the world's inhabitants. We are people who have been blessed, and blessed in so many different ways. And it hasn't just happened by luck. It hasn't just happened by the American dream. God is working, God is doing things. He's caused us to have the lives that we have for a reason. And then he's looking at us and he's asking us, what are you doing with the things that I've gifted you? What are you doing with the things that I've blessed you with? The reality is, those of us in the room this morning have more opportunity than most people in the world will ever dream about. And we've all been gifted. We've all been given unique gifts by God that he's given us to use for his glory. And they're different. All of us have different gifts. Like Joseph had his gift. We all have different gifts. And the challenge for us today is, what are we going to do with them? Because no matter how successful we are, how much wealth we have, no matter how much we're succeeding in our career, whatever we're doing, we have to ask ourselves the question that, is a person in my circumstances, with the blessings that I have, the opportunities that I have, the gifts that I have given to me by God, what would a person in my circumstances do if they were absolutely certain that God was with them? And last week, Pastor Will asked that question about Joseph at his lowest points. At our lowest points, what would we do if we were absolutely certain that God was with us? And today, we're going to be asking that question about our lives when things are going well, when things are good. What would we do? How would we live? How would we respond if we were absolutely sure that God was with us? The hard part for us is, it's a big problem, is that in the moments when we're doing well, in the moments when we're succeeding, we get so caught up in ourselves that we miss the fact that God's with us at all. Because when we look at what we've accomplished and what has happened, we say, I did that. I made that happen. I achieved that. And we forget that it's been God who's been working behind the scenes at every point to bring us to where we are. It's easy when we're struggling. It's easy when things are difficult, when we're desperate for us to turn to him and ask for him to step in. And sometimes it's the hardest place when things are good, when things are going well, when we recognize that we're blessed. For us to turn to God and remember that he's there and he's working. So I'm praying today that Joseph is a great model for us of what that looks like. So we're going to be Genesis 41, if you guys have it open. We're going to start reading in verse 1. This is what it says. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. Now, those 2 years that happened there, that's 2 years since the cupbearer left prison and went back to his job working for Pharaoh. So for 2 more years, Joseph has been sitting in prison, struggling through everything that he's been through and realizing all those things. Joseph's been stuck there. And Pharaoh has a dream at this point. Now, that's important for a few reasons. One, remember, Pharaoh is the most important, the most powerful person in the world at this point in time. And so Pharaoh, for the Egyptians, the pharaohs were considered to be divine beings, almost like gods. And so when a pharaoh would have a dream, it was a significant thing. It was considered to be prophetic or prophecy. And so this dream mattered in a lot of big ways. And so Pharaoh has this super weird dream. And so I'm going to kind of spell it out for you. I've got some visuals on the screen, but he dreams that 7 cows came up out of the Nile River. Okay, so 7 fat cows. They're doing really well. They're just hanging out and eating. But at the same time, 7 skinny cows appear. And so seven like skinny, frail cows come out and they actually eat all of the fat cows. Now that's weird, right? But that's what happens. They eat the fat cows. It's weird. So, and then he dreams about these stalks of grain, and on stalks of grain, there were 7 plump, big heads of grain that were great. But at the very same time, 7 skinny kind of rotting heads of grain appeared, and they ate the plump, big, good heads of grain. So super weird dream. And so Pharaoh is like, I don't know what this means. I need to figure out what to do. And so here's what he does. Look at verse 8. It says, so in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. And then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. See, in this moment where Pharaoh is standing there and he's had all of his people come and try and figure out what these dreams meant, and they can't do it, the cupbearer remembers all of a sudden, hey, when I was in prison 2 years ago, there was this guy there, I think his name was Joseph, and Joseph described to me and explained to me the thing that I was dreaming about. He's like, this is the guy that you need to step in and tell you what is going on. So in verse 14, it says, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And so Joseph, in one moment, goes from being a guy who's stuck in a pit in prison to all of a sudden, he's standing in front of the most powerful person in the entire world. This is a big moment for him. It's a moment of huge opportunity, the kind of moment that could change everything about his life. And I don't know about you, and maybe you've experienced a moment like this before, where kind of everything's on the line, and you feel like, this is my time. I felt like that a little bit when I saw my now wife, and I was like, this is my time. I got to make something happen here. So maybe it's that for you, or maybe it's a job promotion that you're up for, or an interview for a job, or I don't know what it is, but one of those kinds of moments that you feel like could change everything. Joseph is here right now. And when we find ourselves in these moments, sometimes we're so caught up in ourselves that we tend to lose sight of the fact that God is moving and working, and he's making things happen, and we take credit. We take the credit away from him in moments like this. But look at verse 16. Look at what Joseph does. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. How would a person who was absolutely certain that God was with them respond in the circumstance that Joseph is in? Well, first, I think that we would recognize God's gifts. We would recognize God's gifts. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it's not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. See, Joseph realized it wasn't about him. That this ability to interpret dreams isn't something that he worked hard at for years and he made it happen. No, it's something that God gave to him, something that God produced in him and that God grew in him. Getting to this opportunity wasn't something that Joseph made happen. In fact, there wasn't much that he could do stuck in prison to make something like this happen, but it's something that God had been working all the time to bring his life to this point where he was in this moment. And he, in this moment, didn't give himself credit, but he recognized that it was the hand of God that was working behind it all. And he could have taken credit for it. I mean, think about it. When you're at that one defining moment that you feel like could change everything, it seems like it would be silly to point at somebody else and say, no, it's because of them. But man, when you're up for that promotion, you want to be like, I've worked hard. I earned this. I deserve this. But it's not what Joseph does here. Instead, he recognizes that God has been at work and that God did something. A lot of you guys know that I was in a band for a long time, and I talk about it because it was super important to me at that stage in my life. In fact, it was probably the most important thing in my life at that moment, kind of in college and post-college. And we were able to do a lot and traveled and did all kinds of things. But honestly, for me, that band became a little bit of an idol. It took a position in my heart that it probably didn't need to have in a lot of different ways. And because of that, God called me away from it and called me to, when Emily and I got married, for us to move away, to go to seminary. I knew that I was called to ministry, and God gave me a specific call. And so being willing to set aside this band was a difficult thing, but I wanted to be obedient to God. I didn't want it to become an idol for me. And so I told God, yes, God, I'll do what you want me to do. But then God did something that made me upset. And it was at that point that the band that I felt like I had put so much energy and work into began to experience a pretty good amount of success for where we were and who we were. And I'd always had a dream. There was a music festival in Illinois called Cornerstone. It's a Christian music festival. Some of you guys may have heard of it. And it had been my dream to just go to Cornerstone Music Festival. Thousands of people there every year, every summer in Illinois. It had been my dream to go, and we got the opportunity to go and play at Cornerstone Music Festival. And I was like, God, this is awesome. I'm really thankful for it, but why now? Why are you doing this to me now? This doesn't seem like the moment. And then I found out that this label, a record label that we had pretty much always wanted to be on, was going to come and see us play at this concert, at this festival. And I was like, God, I appreciate this, but why now? Why are you doing this to me now? And I got mad. Because to me, it didn't seem fair that God would take this thing from me at this moment when things seem to be going really well and put me in a different circumstance. And I had to realize in that moment that it wasn't about me. It was about God. It was about what God wanted. It's about how God, yes, gave me gifts. But those gifts weren't so I could achieve things that I wanted to achieve. Those gifts were so that I could use them for his kingdom, for his glory. And I stepped back and realized, man, God has a purpose for everything. And I just needed to be obedient, no matter what it was. Guys, we are people who are blessed. Blessed in so many ways, even in our struggles, even in our hard times, even when it seems like things are terrible. If we really step back and look at our lives, God's blessed us. He's gifted us with so many things. We have homes with electricity and power. We have cars that we drive from place to place. We have air conditioning. If you've ever been on a mission trip, we have air conditioning. It's a big deal, especially in South Carolina. We take it for granted every day. Internet, we can communicate with anyone, get all the information of the world at any point in time. We have these things in our pockets where we can access the whole world right here. We are people who are blessed, and that's just the material stuff of life. You could go on more about that. We have bigger houses than probably our parents had. We have more educational opportunities than they ever experienced. But that's just the material stuff. Our lives are filled with even more important gifts from God. The gifts that he's given us that we can use, that we can grow in. We have people in our lives, our family, our friends, who are there, who are a support, who walk with us through this thing called life. We get the joy to wake up every morning and chase after the dreams that God has put in our heart. Man, we are people who are blessed. And God's given us all unique gifts. Really special gifts that we can't ignore that he has given us. And we've got to use them. Joseph's gift was weird, interpreting dreams. But man, God used it in a huge way. This is crazy, but this morning I had two people in our church come up to me and say, I had the weirdest dream last night or this past week. And I wanted to be like, all right, here we go. This is what your dream means, but I quickly realized I don't have that gift, and one of them was super weird, and I don't know. So I don't have the gift of interpreting dreams. That's not a gift that God has given me, but God has given me gifts. Just like God has given you a gift, and he's given you those gifts for a reason and for a purpose. And we spend so much of our lives using the gifts that God has given us for him on ourselves. And when we do that, we weaken them and we water them down and they lose their power. And we don't want to be people who rob from God what he's given to us. So what would a person in our circumstances, with our giftings, with our opportunities do if we were absolutely certain that God was with us? We would look and see that God has given us so much. It's the first thing. We would just recognize it. See, Pharaoh recognized that about Joseph in this situation. Look at verse 25. After Pharaoh tells Joseph his dreams, it says, "Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, 'The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years. The 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty ears, blighted by the east wind, are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do.'" Notice this. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. What else would a person with our opportunities do if they were absolutely certain that God was with them? Number 2, we would use our gifts to point to God. Joseph does that twice here. In verse 25, God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. In verse 28, it is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Joseph doesn't take credit. He's clear. This is something God has done, something God is doing, something God is going to show, something God is going to reveal. And he explains it. Hey, basically this means there's going to be 7 years of abundance here. 7 years where things are going to go way better than you could possibly imagine in the land of Egypt. It's going to be so good. But those 7 good years are going to be followed by 7 years of famine. And those 7 years of famine are going to be so bad that you're going to forget how good the first 7 years were. This place is going to be struggling and it's going to be suffering. And so Joseph uses these gifts, he uses this situation to point to God. God's going to tell you what is happening. This famine is happening. It's going to be bad. And then he speaks more about it. Look at verse 33. He says, "Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers of the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine." So Joseph launches into strategy here. Now, think about this. This is a guy who was thrown into a pit by his brothers, sold into as a slave, wrongly accused of rape. He's been in prison for years. All of that is in his head, and he's at this moment where he's standing in front of the most powerful person in the world, and he's like, "Here's what you need to do. This is how you run your country." He was just in prison for years, but he's standing in front of Pharaoh at this moment. He's like, "Here's what you do." How could he do this? Because he was absolutely certain that God was with him. And when we're sure of that, God is able to accomplish more than we could ask and imagine. He chose to let his gifts point to God. Look at verse 39. This is crazy. "Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are.'" Like, I would have thought he was being sarcastic, but he's not. He says, "You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." In a matter of moments, Joseph goes from a guy who's been in prison for years to being the second most powerful person in the entire world. Do you think that when he was going through everything that he went through, stuck in a pit, sold into slavery, running away from an accusation that he knew he didn't do to ending up in prison, do you think he could have possibly imagined that he was going to end up where he was? I can't imagine that. But what I know from it is that sometimes God has bigger dreams for us than we can possibly ever dream for ourselves. And when we take the great gifts that God has given us and we use them on our own, we waste them and we squander them. And we miss the opportunities that God wants to see happen for us. God created us for a purpose. He created our gifts for a reason and for a purpose, and they're to be used to point to Him and not to ourselves. And when we use our gifts for our own pleasure, then we rob the giver of His pleasure. And ultimately, our greatest pleasure, when we use God's great gifts for our small purposes, they cease to be great and they become about us. I love how C.S. Lewis puts this in his book, The Weight of Glory. He says this, he says, "We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased." And we spend our lives running after ourselves and our wants and our desires, making mud pies when God has so much for us if we just give our lives and our gifts back to Him. What gifts of God are you making mud pies with? The gifts He's given you, your career, your house, your money, your time. If you allowed God to get what He wanted out of your life, what would it look like? If you allowed God to get what He wanted out of the gifts that He's given you, how would you use those gifts differently? If you allowed God the ability to get what He wanted out of your time, out of your schedule, out of your calendar, how would your time look differently each week, each day? If you allowed God to get what He wanted out of your money and your finances, how would your life look different? Are those things in your life pointing to God, or are they pointing to you? If we're absolutely certain that God gave us those things and that He was with us, what would we do with them? Look at verse 53. It says, "The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said to the Egyptians, 'Go to Joseph, what he says to you, do.' So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth." What else would we do if we were absolutely certain that God was with us in our moments of success and opportunity? Number 3, we would use His gifts to bless others. It's what Joseph does here. He could have hoarded it. He could have kept it for himself. He could have kept it for Egypt. But he didn't do that. He opened up the storehouses, and not just for Egypt, but for all the lands of the earth to come and be blessed and to get what they need. It's a reminder to us that God doesn't give us good things for us or because of us. He gives us good things to show us that He's good. He blesses us so that we can bless others. And we've all experienced God's blessing and God's gifting and to different degrees and in different ways. We look at our lives and think about the gifts that we have. How are we using those things to bless others? How are we using those things to be an encouragement, sacrificially, to show other people the love of God? Because that's what a person in our circumstances would do if we were absolutely certain that God was with us. One of our guiding values as a church is generosity. I think it was probably about 8 years ago, we were redoing our values, and we mixed them together and we added one. And the one that we added was generosity. And it wasn't because we felt like this is who we are, but we prayed about it and we felt like God was telling us, this is who I want you to be. And so we put generosity on the list and we began to pray that God would prove himself by helping us be people who were generous. Man, it's been such a joy over the last few years for me to experience how that's become so true about our church. I've seen it in so many different ways, not only in the finances that are given so faithfully, that we've gone from a church that honestly struggled financially to be blessed, to see people giving and sacrificing of their finances for God's mission. But I see it in so many other ways. For our folks to take and sacrifice their time and be generous with their time to serve on a team here at the church. So many of our leaders and kids and students and every other team that we have doing things that maybe they wouldn't choose to do on their own, but they want to be faithful with the time that God has given them. And so they want to use their gifts that God has given them. And so they're deciding to sacrifice those things and be generous with them for the kingdom instead of just using them on their own. I see it in the way that you guys give up and sacrifice a night of your week, which I know is precious and important, so that you can be part of a community that's living and serving on God's mission in a missional community. That is generosity. I see it as I see people give up one of the only weeks of vacation that they have in a year so that they can go and serve on the mission of God overseas on a mission trip. I see it in the way that we sacrifice our heart and our emotions to care for people who are walking through hard and difficult stuff in life. That is generosity. I see it in the people who, even this week, are going to spend their afternoons cleaning their house so that people can come over from their missional community and be a part of what God is doing in their home and through their missional community. I could go on and on and on in how I see God proving himself in making us a generous church, but I know why. Because as we live as people who are generous, then we show a world that's looking for hope and that's looking for something outside of us, that we serve a God who is generous. That we get to be generous because God was first generous to us. That God gave his son, Jesus, his own son, as a sacrifice so that we could be brought back into a relationship with him. That is generosity to its extreme. And that Jesus was humbly obey his Father and walk a road and a life, leaving heaven, leaving his seat on a throne next to God, coming and becoming like us, living a life that he knew was leading towards his death. That's generosity. And every blow to his side and every nail that hung him to the cross is a symbol of how generous God is. And you see, guys, when we get to display generosity, we're not doing it for us. We're doing it because we get to give people a glimpse and a picture of the generosity that God has already shown to us. And there's no better joy, there's no better reason for us to do it than putting the good news of Jesus on display. Generosity is a gospel issue. And it's what we would do if we were absolutely certain that in our moments experiencing God's gifting, in our moments of opportunity, in our moments of blessing, if we were certain God is with us, it's exactly what we do. See, guys, one day we're going to stand before God. And we're going to give an account of everything that he's given to us. You see this in Jesus' parables. But when we really honestly believe that what we have in life is a gift from God, that he gave it to us, that we're stewards of it, that we're holding on to it for him, that we're using it for him. And one day we're going to stand before him, and what are our lives going to say about what we did with the things that God gave us? Are they going to show that we use the gifts, that we use the opportunities, that we use the moments, the relationships, the time, and everything to point to him and to bless other people? Or is it going to say that we squandered them on ourselves? We have one life, lots of gifts, lots of moments, lots of opportunities. We want to give them to him. I want you guys to stand up with me this morning. This morning, we all have things on us that represent everything that God has given us. So maybe you have a watch on your wrist, or you have a phone in your pocket that shows you the time. And it shows you that your time, your calendar, your schedule is a gift that God has given you. Your life is a gift. Your hours are a gift. Your days are a gift. And these things represent that gift and how you're using it. Maybe you have a wallet in your pocket that you could pull out, or keys. And those things represent the material blessings that God has given you. And you have your phone as well that represents all the relationships, your contacts, your social media people, and so many ways that we have to keep in touch with people that God's given us relationships with. And this morning, what I want to ask you to do is to take those things, and I want you to put them in your hands and hold them out. These things that represent the gifts that God has given us. Everybody, go ahead, pull them out. I want you to hold them out in your hands. Now, some of us are doing this. We're like hanging on to it tightly because we don't want to let go. And I want you to hold your hands out open. Remember, this stuff is not yours. It's God's, and he's given it to you. And we want to come before God and say, God, these are blessings, these are gifts that you've given me in my life. I don't want to squander them. I don't want to waste them. I want to use them to show people how much you love them. I want to use them to bless people. And we can't do that if we're hanging on to them. We can only do that if we're coming before God with open hands, saying, God, it's yours. You take it. You do what you want with it. You use it for your sake and not mine. So I'm going to pray for us. I'm going to ask you guys as we do this, just keep holding those things out to the Lord. I'm going to ask for God to reveal and show to us how we can use these things, how we can use our time, how we can use our resources, how we can use our gifts to point people to him, to bless people that God has put in our lives that need to clearly see the gospel. They're going to see it in your life, but not if you're doing this. Only if we have open hands and open hearts. So let's pray together.